I'm Eric Barden.
I'm Amy Barden.
And this is Bombardened. Today we're going to talk with Jacob Ivan Schmitt. Fantastic, interesting guy. Spent the vast majority of his life incarcerated, and recognizes the reasons why, or he has a strong perspective on what we need to do to help folks change their lives. You met him how?
Yeah, I can't remember. I think he reached out to me because I started talking about the carceral system a lot. And so it's funny, on LinkedIn and social media, at a certain point, I thought, I think most of my friends have done time now at this point. You know, folks want to know, what are you saying about this and what are you trying to advance? And I agree, and how can I help? He was interesting to me the first time we spoke for two reasons. One, he had only been released maybe 9 months prior. And very often I'm talking to people where this is long in the rear view mirror. You know, they've been on the advocacy side for a decade or so. The other thing that really struck me is most of my career was in child welfare. And the work that I did in the foster care space is incredibly impactful in my life as I got to know what was happening to kids. I became a dependency court CASA, right? Why are kids coming into this system? And I spoke a lot in the first half of my career about that, you know, foster care to prison pipeline that we have. I spoke out a lot about group homes, that you don't want kids, if we normalize an institutional environment or a hostile environment, we do tend to gravitate toward the familiar. We do. And so it was so interesting to speak to someone who was way downstream and had experienced exactly the types of things I used to forecast and talk about. Because, you know, I was always on the kid side and not on the grown-up side. And so I'd like to talk to him about that, you know, about his childhood and how that, in some ways, predictably, he was going to wind up in prisons.
Yeah, I think that his story is compelling, and particularly with his childhood, and it's something that we all need to understand in terms of the predictability of that. And in some cases, kids are trapped in a circumstance that predictably would lead them to unhealthy choices and perhaps incarceration. And so it'll be interesting to talk to him about that. But then also, like, with a lifetime of in and out of prison, like, what can we do to change the course so folks aren't a lifetime in and out of prison? We need a system. We need a correction system that's actually correct. Yeah, and that's yes, corrected.
That would be good.
So, and that's.
I think we just changed what we called it, and that's as far as we went.
Well, you know, that's the first step, I guess. But we need, and it's to everybody's benefit, right? It's to society's benefit. It's to the system's benefit. It's to the taxpayers' benefit. It's to the community's benefit. It's to the family of the people who are incarcerated. It's a win-win-win scenario if we can get folks to learn from their mistakes and not just lock them up and throw away the key, or more commonly, have folks in and out of jail, in and out of prison incessantly with this chronic recidivism. That doesn't do anybody any good. Right. So it'll be really interesting to see from his perspective, having lived that life, how he got there, but also what we can do differently for the next generation of Jacobs who find themselves incarcerated.
Who are on that path now.
Yeah. Prepare to be bombarded. So Jacob, tell us your summary. What's your story in summary?
Well, I used to be a bank robber. I wasn't very good at it. I kept getting caught.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I'm also a slow learner because I actually tried it as a career move twice. It was a terrible career move. And after 24 and a half years of incarceration for bank robbery, which topped the numbers for adult incarceration at over 30 years, I managed to leverage my way out of prison through a lot of relationships that I built. I don't like the phrase networking. I believe it's too sterile. I'm not networking with the two of you. I'm building relationships.
Exactly.
And, you know, I think that was probably the largest turning point for me in my last term of incarceration. And it was a very accidental decision. What happened was I literally just made this very seemingly casual decision, understanding the level of vulnerability it exposed me to, but I decided that relationships with other people mattered more than anything else. And over the next year and a half, my life changed so dramatically that I couldn't even recognize the way it was before that. And ultimately, when I distilled it down, what I realized was I stopped surviving and I started living. And, I actually gave speeches in Toastmasters while I was in prison about this. And the thing is, like, we end up in survival mode for a lot of different reasons. And not everybody in survival mode ends up in prison. But for those of us that do end up in prison, we have oftentimes concluded that when we identify a want or a need, and oftentimes we conflate the two, that we're willing to do whatever it is to get it, to secure it while we're in survival mode. And of course, because by virtue of the space we're in incarceration, in prison, we were willing to break the law to do that.
So would you characterize that as sort of a feeling of desperation?
Absolutely.
I mean, if you're in survival mode, that you're at a desperate place, you see few ways out. So speak to that a little bit. So you're a horrible bank robber, but you have tenacity because you stick with it. So
yes.
right. So, but take us back to that. What was the survival mode? What was the desperation?
So I'm a survivor of childhood trauma.
Okay.
I've been diagnosed with complex PTSD, adult and childhood trauma with an aggressive response. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I punch people, although there has been a history of that. I haven't punched anybody for a few years. I'm feeling pretty good about that.
That's good. We're feeling better about this combo.
Yeah. And you were in the foster care
very
system, right? Because I feel like that was one of the first things that we connected across.
So, I guess therapy helps me with this, has helped me with this. So my mother, Shirley, almost killed me when I was about 31 months old in September of 1976. I still have the cracks in my skull from where she threw me down the hallway. At 4.5 years old, at that point, I went to live with my father and then woman who became my stepmother. They were both very violent alcoholics. And at 4.5 years old, my father put a security chain on the outside of my bedroom door and started locking me in. And he gave me a Folgers can to shit and piss. It's understandably, I was an emotionally disturbed child at that point. And they let me go down to California with my mom, Shirley, and when I was just before I turned 6, to do an inpatient evaluation at Stanford Children's Hospital, Lucille Packard's Children's Hospital at Stanford.
Wow.
And I actually have the reports, and I vaguely remember. I remember some of the things, like there's this nurse, she charted this engagement, this interaction between me and my mom, and I'm only just now calling her my mom.
Yeah.
There's some history there as how I got to the place where I would actually call her mom. And what happened was she was being very controlling and demanding. And, of course, I was kind of being resistant. So I was getting upset, and she told me to punch her in the arm. And she said, literally, it's in the chart notes, and I remembered this, you have to hit to get your anger out. Mm. And finally, she managed to get me to hit her on the arm. And for a lot of years of my life, I was very upset at her. I've got scars all over my knuckles. I don't know how many fights I've been in. Yeah. Probably between 150 and 200. I don't know who teaches an emotionally disturbed child that you have to hit to get your anger out. But let me footnote that I actually do know somebody who's suffered and somebody who is not healed and probably never had a chance to heal. And because I now know some of her history, I also realize the sacrifice she was making because she had been abused, and she was willing to endure more physical abuse to help her child in a way that she thought would be helpful. But for a lot of years, I was very resentful towards her. And not to get diverged from where you were asking me to go. So I turned 6 years old doing that inpatient evaluation. Sadly, I wasn't left there. I wish that I had been left there. I feel like they were probably the best suited to try to help this, as a 6-year-old boy. And I remember they chart that I was always asking people for hugs. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, somewhere along the lines, that little boy, that person who asked for hugs, disappeared. And then I found him again. And so I hug people.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
When were you first arrested?
Oh, well, that's part of that chain of events. I guess you have to define arrested. They took me back to Alaska, and I spent 20 months in Alaska Psychiatric Institute, which, as you can imagine, going from California to Alaska, how far behind the times they were, so to speak. It was very barbaric. I remember this counselor who would wet a bedspread and roll me up in it, give it a roll, put an arm in, give it another roll, put an arm in. He'd get me all rolled up in it, and then he'd put a belt on me. They had to put me in a quiet room when I would kick and bang on the door and scream and holler for somebody to come. They would come, and they would give me a shot in my butt and strap me down on 4-point restraints. From there, I returned home for brief stints. I ended up living with some friends of the family who certainly weren't friends of mine. They sexually abused me physically, emotionally, mentally, left me with my eggs almost permanently scrambled. When I was 10 years old, my sister told our mom, who was visiting, that my father had been sexually abusing her. So he beat me and he raped her. And she left to go to California. She left me there in Anchorage all by myself with them. And I had at some point discovered how to slide if I pulled my door shut so it was just cracked, I could use a comb to push the security chain so it would pop out. And I would wait for my stepmom, Jean, to get really, really drunk, because she would start drinking first thing in the morning, and she would usually pass out in the afternoon. And I would slip the chain, and I discovered that if I took one of my father's little blue pills, which turned out to be sleeping pills or pain pills, and drank a beer, I was feeling really good. Yeah. And I felt good enough one day that I was actually going to call in a bomb threat to the school that had kicked me out. And I had a very short-lived career as a terrorist, because I was like, hey, there's a bomb in the building, get everybody out. And the lady was like, what? I said, there's a bomb, bitch, get everybody out. Jacob, is that you? I was horrified. I hung up. I was like, what? Oh my God, they've got cameras or something. But
Jacob,
in my
little
stoned mind, I forgot about it quickly until the police officer showed up. Yeah. And when he left, Jean laid into me with a passion that was almost unprecedented. She beat me for a little while with my skateboard, and when she got tired and she went out, presumably to get a drink or something from the kitchen, I managed to get over to my sock drawer. And I'd found this buck knife down by the creek. The blade didn't lock anymore on it, and I pushed my bedroom door shut when she was trying to come back in, and I knew I couldn't hold it to keep her out, so I stabbed it through the door. It's just very thin door. I never stabbed her. I was just trying to keep her from getting back to me. And she stopped trying to push her way in, and I crawled out my window, and I'm going down the road in this trailer park, and I remember my socks were falling off my feet. They were so wet. And police car picked me up. They took me back to Alaska Psychiatric Institute. So if you're asking me about arrests, I feel like that's an arrest. Then they decided they were going to send me out of state. So they let me go down to a place out in Lake Oswego, locked group home, which is thankfully shut down now. I went down there a few months ago, and I got some closure when I discovered that they lost their licensing about 18 years ago. Yeah. And I was there 2 years, and I went to live in California with my mom at 13, and I was in the system within 3 months.
Yeah. So I talk a lot about how we knew asylums were bad, right? We knew inpatient care was not care at all. And so we closed everything rather than redesigning. There's always been a portion of the population who has needed inpatient care to properly get diagnosed and healed, that it takes a really long time. These days, I'm talking about corrections in almost exactly the same terms. The system is bad. I think judges, public defenders, even officers, I think a lot of people are not wanting to refer, are not wanting to sentence, but it's because nobody thinks it's healing. I haven't heard anyone say, yeah, corrections is great, juvenile detention, wonderful place. In fact, from people inside that system, I've heard the opposite, that if you do change your life, you're an outlier. That is not designed basically to repattern behavior and help you know how to have functional relationships. So as somebody who knows the system well, because you re-entered quite recently, right?
17 and a half months ago.
Yeah, okay.
And it was not the normal. I didn't serve my sentence.
Yeah.
The Pierce County Prosecutor's Office brought me back to re-sentence me. using a law called what we call 6164, which is essentially if they believe the sentence no longer furthers the interest of justice. And their ask was to reduce my sentence by 13 years, and the judge, because it was a substantial showing of rehabilitation, actually reduced it by 17. Either way, I had served the time.
Yeah.
But it was still a very nice acknowledgement to have that happen. Funny thing, though, so I'm in the hearing, because I'm doing it by Zoom, and my old counselor, who's a very close and dear friend of mine, a woman named Lindsay Robinson, and another woman from the records department, Parker Boehner, and I think even a third one, they were there to just support me. And so I turned to the lady on my left, Alicia, who's running the Zoom and everything. I said, "Am I muted?" And she said, "Yeah." So I turned her back. I said, "Hey, Lindsay, pass me up a diaper. I'm getting nervous." She thought I asked her to unmute me. So the whole courtroom gets to hear this. And everybody thought, and thankfully when I look back, the judge was laughing. So it's not often that you get on in a court record, "Hey, listen, hand me a diaper. I'm getting nervous."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it was, listen, I traveled galaxies so quickly because most people walk up to their release date. I'm 17 months out, I'm 15 months out. And for me, it happened. I left DOC 6 weeks later. I went into federal detention for 6 weeks, and then I walked out, and many, many galaxies away.
So it's really interesting, Amy's question about, we hear it's not rehabilitative, and then yet you
changed.
In spite of.
the system.
And one of the things with Amy, following Amy around, is she finds folks who have changed their lives, and so we've had the opportunity to talk with a lot of folks who, by virtue of incarceration, were able to spend the amount of time necessary to sort of address perhaps their contribution, even though, like, for example, in your case, like, that's a horrific childhood. You're describing an absolutely horrific childhood that nobody should have to endure, and yet we have kids that are coming from that environment. What we need to do, and we chatted about this before the camera started rolling, is we agree that whatever we're doing with the criminal justice system should be rehabilitative, and we need to create an opportunity for folks to think differently and to change their lives. And you've done that. So tell us a little bit about that. Tell us, maybe in spite of, or because of, or is there a nuanced sort of combination of issues going on there? But you sit here today as a person full of integrity, and yet you didn't always.
I would disagree with it didn't always, and so would many of my friends. I just didn't have a level of integrity that society found acceptable. I want to push back just slightly on something that you said. It is not a criminal justice system. It is a legal system. Justice is not found in the brutality of the sentencing laws that exist in Washington State, in my opinion. And let's focus on Washington State substantively, but let's talk about culture. So I went to the California Authority when I was 15 years old, and it was an immersion into a dementia, just fighting, and good nature. Like, there was never really any maliciousness, but we fought all the time. And when I was riding the chain bus into San Quentin at 18, I was chained to this guy, and he was an older biker. He was 32. And he said, "Man, how do you feel, man? Are you nervous?" I was like, "No, man, I'm excited, man," because I had been being trained to go there.
Yeah.
I mean, my childhood set me on a single trajectory. I was going to prison. But now let's talk about what happens when a person goes to prison, because I think that's the important thing. People go to prison for committing a crime, and then they return to the community as criminals. There's a lot of responsibility that we can lay at a system that is failing and has failed, but there's also a lot of responsibility that rests at the feet of the people who are in confinement. And towards that, I'm going to speak a little bit about what's called the Convict Code. The Convict Code contributed to creating more criminals than any sentence that a judge has ever imposed, because people would go to prison for committing a crime, just like I did. I walked into San Quentin, and I remember a black guy that I was in county jail in the hole with came and brought me a book. And the man in the cell next to me, who turned out to be an neighborhood member, said, "Don't ever do that again." I was like, "Man, what? Don't ever," and he made a racial slur up to one of our cells. part of my story, which I don't know that I ever told Amy, was I was one of the core members of the Indian family here in Washington State. And it never had anything really, and family, I'm just going to footnote that it was founded by a guy who was part Native American, and we had Jewish members and stuff. So it's got this really heinous name to it because you got to have a scary name, right? You got to have a ferocious name. You don't name a monster truck Cloud or something like that, right? So this convict code, was one that was perpetuated by people based on the theory of misery loves company. See, when I walked into San Quentin at 18 years old, I didn't have men my age saying, hey, kid, I don't want you to end up like me. Let's get you over here and get your GED. And I got connections for you. I want you to get into this HVAC union. I got connections, and I want you to go on and move. And here's the stepping stones for that. But today, we have those people. And there is a cultural change happening in prisons, specifically here in Washington. And I'm proud to say that I was one of the contributors to working towards a cultural change within the prison that I was in. And it was a stated and declared goal between me and my friend and colleague, Yusuf Jihad, who founded a peer-based reentry program with the single intention of changing the culture of prison and then dissecting how we do that. Back to your point of how does a person heal in that space? And I'll give you this question. How does a person heal from trauma when they're constantly incurring trauma? And I literally just had this conversation yesterday morning with a dear friend of mine of 30 years who I was very instrumental in helping get before the clemency board for a clemency hearing, and the governor granted him clemency and released him 9 years before the end of his sentence. And of all things, we were sitting at a coffee shop down the street from the very prison we had been in together yesterday morning having coffee, and we talked about that because the thing is, you want us to heal in prison, and you're going to heal us so that the place hurts more. And that's what happened to me.
Explain that. What do you mean by that?
You don't really understand. So you can boil a frog alive if you turn the water up slow enough. And a frog can jump out. Granted, they may jump into the fire, but that's not the point. We become so desensitized and so dehumanized that we don't realize the abuse that we're suffering. And you want to heal us so that you strip us of the armor that we have, whether that armor is just the ability to ignore it. But whatever the case, however you look at it, it's so that the place hurts more. We're surrounded by hardness. No matter how good you do, you're surrounded by hard chairs and hard beds and hard walls and hard people.
Okay, so let's this is fascinating, and I want to go down this path with you, but I want to talk about, so you've talked about survivor mentality, desperation. You've talked about armor, like you had a protective front to deal with the difficult circumstances that you're in, and yet you're surrounded by all this hardness, right? So, what would you do? I mean, what would you do differently? Like, so for example, the community, right? So if you're out in community, and you're robbing banks, the community has an expectation that folks not do that, and the teller goes to work, and the teller doesn't want to, deal with that, and the bank doesn't want to deal with that, and the community that's surrounding that and going in to get, service their bank account shouldn't be exposed to that, right? So there needs to be an enforcement program.
Certainly.
The police need to come. The police, the subject is arrested. But then this is where I think we probably have a lot of common ground, is that while we're protecting community and we're protecting society from behavior that we've deemed unacceptable, that's still a person. Whoever that suspect is still a person. And what we need, and that person is inevitably going to get out. Again, 95, 97% of folks incarcerated are going to be our neighbors and going to be walking amongst us in the Target, right? Driving an Audi, maybe, at least in your
Sipping
case.
a latte.
Yeah, I know. But we want those folks to be contributing members of community and to be healthy, both physically and mentally healthy. So let's focus this discussion. Okay, you're in survivor mode. Your armor's being broken down. what should we be doing differently? How can we address this?
I'm glad you brought this up, but I want to ask you to also put a pin in this one. I want to tell you about my leaving the family and ending up in the Witness Security Protection Program for 7.5 years.
Absolutely do
Because
that.
I think that's an important part
That's
of my
huge.
change. So really what you're talking about, and I love that you brought this up, is we're talking about tribal thinking. What happens when, and like as in my case, at 15 years old, I ended up in the California Youth Authority. Prior to that, I had no exposure to this division between whites and other color, black people, norteños, and strangers. Had no idea.
Yeah.
And by pure chance, literally chance, fell in with the white kids. And I'm glad that I did, because I'm telling you, I swear to you right now, I don't know how it is today in the California Youth Authority, but I promise you 80% of the white kids were getting beaten up and getting their property taken. And half of them were sucking dick, and half of them were also getting fucked in their ass. And I remember seeing it. And I remember walking past it. And I'm ashamed, even though I was a child, that I thought that they were less than me because they were letting that happen. Okay? That was my first exposure. Prior to going to the California Youth Authority, every aberrant behavior that I had demonstrated was a detriment to me in society. I couldn't remain in school. I didn't have friends. I couldn't remain in a place to live. My mother would, kick me out. I was on the streets. I went to the California Youth Authority, and every negative attribute became a positive. Everything about me became something that was worthwhile. And I found friends, what I thought were friends, and I found a place that I belonged, where I fit in. So I'll talk to you about tribal thinking. What happens when the carceral space becomes your tribe and people in the community are non-tribe? Because let's be clear about things. Our brains still operate almost the same way as they did when we were 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years ago. And just to be clear, I'm a Christian. I don't believe in evolution. With that said, when you see somebody who's non-tribe, you have two thoughts. Is this person a threat? And then is this person a conquest? We try to reprogram our brains, and we try to smile a lot. And when I met Amy, I knew friend. But when you are in survival mode, and when prison is your tribe and society is non-tribe, and you return to the community, please ask me how that person is supposed to feel like they're not a potential conquest or even a threat. Because we talk about leaving prison, let's talk about that's fear.
Yeah.
Returning to the community is mind-blowing, almost overwhelming fear. So today, we have better models in place. We have bridges being built because we're taking people from the community and allowing them to come inside for events, for reentry symposiums, for all these things, to build the bridge. Because here's the thing, right? The model we have in place of pre-release and post-release, they both were built out of desperation. Nobody at MIT said, hey, I've got this brilliant idea on how we do this.
Yeah.
It was desperation. And you know who's left to build the bridge between the two is the person who's incarcerated. And bridge building takes skills. Most people who are incarcerated, particularly like me, who is a chronic recidivist, do not have the skills to build a bridge. And when we fail to do that, we get 100% accountability. We're told we're a bad apple when it's really a bad barrel.
Yeah.
And I'll just say again, like I've said before, ground balls don't make it out of the park. If you don't launch somebody on a trajectory to succeed, I'm tired of hearing about what a failure they are because they didn't get out of the park. Tribal thinking is what we have to overcome, because that was the model. And that was also largely an extension of the convict code, which we are seeing it wither. We are seeing it die. It is dying on the vine today, and it's dying on the vine because people like me stand in the face of it. You said something a few minutes ago, and I'm going to tell you that when you're in Rome, you do as the Romans do.
Yeah.
And until you build enough fear factor to tell people, mind your fucking business, I'm going to do what I want. Like when I was in federal prison down in Florida, and I was the first white guy to eat on the black side of the chow hall. I did the fuck I want.
Yeah.
And I had to be dangerous to do it. And people had to know I was dangerous. And that's an unfortunate thing, because today I lead with kindness. And anyway, so I don't know. I'm maybe traveling a little bit there. I hope I answered your question about what is this dynamic? What is happening?
Well, and again, it's invisible. I think you just articulated and synthesized something that's really important that I keep hearing, which is your pattern to do the opposite of what works. So again, there's like pro-social, there's good behaviors. That's how you get hired. That's how you get into healthy relationships. That's how you have friends that are true friends. You lack those qualities, right? If you had those qualities, you're probably not in prison.
Mm-hmm.
And in prison, suddenly all of those negative qualities are positive and reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. We have a friend, Dave, who said, I loved it. He did 5 years. He was like, I ran that place. He was very successful in that environment and I think felt powerful. And he was not sad to be returned to the environment. It was actually
Rat. Have you read King Rat?
No.
By James Clavell? You have not, really?
I haven't.
It's about a World War II prison camp, and King was his name, and he knew how to make every move in that place.
Yeah.
He ate fresh eggs every day. He was part of the black market. He was the man.
Yeah.
And then when they were all being released, and he was sitting in the back of the truck to leave, had his head hanging.
Yeah.
And Philip Marlowe, who he had saved Philip's life by getting medication for him, asked him what was wrong, and he's like, I'm nobody outside of here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And you
that's how
don't,
we feel
and
when
again,
we
it's
come
like the
home.
jungle we know. I'm always talking about the survival bias that we feel once something becomes our normal space. I talk about this with homelessness too. If this is my community and we've been under this bridge and I know how to navigate it, it is the mammal brain, right? You're more inclined to stay in that environment. The other thing I learned quickly is that we don't generally have peers leading programs in jails and prisons. That's piecemeal. It's starting to happen some places, but people tell me again and again, Amy, you never would have been the one to help me. You never would have been. Nobody who looks like you or is trained like you is going to tell me what it's like to be me and what I need.
Well, now you're to the trail of breadcrumbs. None of you can leave a trail of breadcrumbs from that prison cell
Right.
to the community.
Right.
You can leave one at best from the officer's station. And unfortunately, and I'll also speak to the lens of suspicion, because the reason why these programs are so hard to rise and to lift is the Department of Corrections has a culture. It's this lens of suspicion stops these programs from rising.
What is the suspicion anchored in?
It is a culture. We are changing as a culture as prisoners, but the culture within the prison is not changing because largely it's perpetuated. Now, look, boots on the ground line staff, 80, 90% of them I like. Some of them I love.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I was in the prison I released from, and I saw officers, and I hugged them, and we shook hands, and it was emotional, and it was good. But there's also people there, they perpetuate a culture that is just too brutal. The lens of suspicion inhibits much of what we want to do. But it also marries this culture that we're seeing wither, that they say they want to die and they want it to change. But it's not actually something that they're living. It's something they say and they don't live it.
So police are necessary, jails are necessary, prisons are necessary. But what's the fundamental change you'd like to see? We've talked about tribalism, we talked about hard, we've talked about maybe the dehumanization of folks in there. What's the fundamental change? If there's a simple change, what's the fundamental change you'd like to see?
Like if tomorrow wave a wand, policy,
You
but
get
it could be
one
the
thing.
building.
So you
No,
need to
I want more. I want at least three things.
no, watch this. You need to introduce humanity to this process. And humanity is not the United States of America was built on systemic racism. The United States Constitution specifically excluded people who are any portion black, excluded women from having rights. For better or for worse, you and I are the face of white supremacy as they used to see it then. So when we talk about the carceral space here in America, let's be very clear, because I'll be happy to go through the history of it, where the laws were specifically targeted at people of color. Where in the North we had penitentiaries, which was driven by religious ideals, and in the South we had chain gangs. And we see which died. They retained the name penitentiary, but the truth is they went for the money. The 13th Amendment allowed for slavery. It just had to be done at the hand of justice. There is no justice, there is just us. And at that hand, we saw the spawning of an industry that is today, it's the prison industrial complex. So when you say police are necessary, prosecutors are necessary, prisons are necessary, let's unpack that a little bit. The police that we have today, they're not neighborhood police. They're military personnel. I don't need the fucking military walking around my neighborhood looking at me like I'm a combatant, okay? And I get fucking really mad about that because people I know have been killed. And so when you have, and my assistant director is a 2-tour combat vet, and I'm just gonna get it said right now, when you have your team and everybody else is a potential combatant, you look at them in a certain way. When I grew up, there were neighborhood police. And they knew us. This cop, Paul Ritter, used to pick me and my sister up because my mom had kicked us out, and he'd have to do the paperwork, and he'd take us to the receiving home, and he'd give us bus fare. He'd be like, look, I know you guys are gonna go right out the back. Please, if you see me, just try to hide. Just make an effort to act like you're hiding so I don't have to pick you up. And he would buy us food and stuff, right? Those things don't exist anymore. These people drive around our neighborhoods. And I want to be clear, like after this big storm we had a few months ago, I remember seeing a police officer with his vehicle stopped and he was pulling tree limbs out of the tree. So there's a lot that law enforcement, that police do more than just arresting people. So much more. But we focus on the arrests. I don't need people who view the community as potential combatants. We need them to be part of the community so that they can see the humanity in the people they're dealing with. And when we talk about the way this process works, are the sentences really mindful? Do they contemplate? I don't believe that we should be allowed to take a life and not have a consequence. I promise you, I don't believe that I should be able to walk into a bank and try to rob them and not have a consequence. But what are we doing to people when that happens? What do the sentences look like? I was invited to Oregon by a county prosecutor for the Dalles, Wasco County, I think it is, about 5 months ago, to meet with his review team because they were considering a friend of mine for basically what their exact same sentencing mechanism is that got me out here in Washington. And I sat next to the ex-police officer who, at the time of my friend's arrest, his pit bull attacked this officer. He was retired. And he said, James he's just served such a long time already. He's served 17 years. In Washington State, we don't consider somebody as serving a long time, so they got 25, 30 years in. We have some of the most draconian sentencing laws in our country in this state, yet we lie and we act like we're progressive. And I'm gonna get it said right now. I don't want to hear any fucking thing again about the Democrats being the savior. The Democrats have been in majority in this state since 2016, and there hasn't been a damn thing changed. I don't want to hear any more vilification and vilifying of Republicans. I got several Republican people that I have tremendous respect for and strong relationships with. At least they're consistent about the things that they promote and they say. They're not liars. Liars are the ones who don't deliver. Liars are the ones who talk out of their mouth and do something else behind your back. They're talking out the side of their neck. So when we talk about Washington State, we have some of the most draconian sentencing laws. We have some of the harshest prison conditions. Yeah, it looks pretty when you walk in there. Imagine what it's like when you do 10 years like that. We need to see a systemic change where the humanity of everybody is considered. You talked about bank tellers. What I used to tell people in the reentry program that I built, where I actively sought to identify the antisocial norms of prison and supplant them with pro-social ones.
Give an example.
Okay, the fact that you think that it's okay to punch somebody when they disrespect you.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
It absolutely is not. And I'll tell you something, what does that disrespect look like? Let's play make-believe. I'm looking at the bulletin board at all the postings they have. Some guy walks past me and bumps into me. Well, that's disrespect. He doesn't say, excuse me, right? So I get a chip on my shoulder, I square off with him, maybe I punch him, we get into a fight, we're in the hole. Or I bite my lip, I suck it up, and later on I say, hey man, maybe the next day, hey dude, I don't know if you knew yesterday you bumped into me. And you know what he says to me then? Dude, I just got off the phone, man, I found out my mom died in a car accident. Maybe that's why. But instead, this antisocial norm, this promotion of violence is something that is the solution, when in actuality, a pro-social response. People are gonna bump into you. You're not gonna like it. Things that you don't like in life do not allow you to commit violence.
Yeah, the specificity of that example seems like that might be real.
That is very real.
Yeah,
and
I
that's
was
why
at the bulletin board.
And I'll tell you something. When you deal with people who have my kind of history in prison, you know what happens? You get a lot of, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. You bump into somebody, hey, look,
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
excuse me. And you know why? Because they know a life hangs in the balance and it could be yours. Because no matter how tough you are, man, somebody else can kill you.
Yeah.
Or else they got friends that'll kill you. I feel like I forgot sort of what we were on the track before I was asked for that.
Well,
Forgive me.
so I mean, the context is beautiful. I mean, the depth of your understanding is really critical to us and to our viewers and to folks to understand what it is you're talking about. But and you've talked about changing culture. That's
what
big.
it's about.
That's big, and I understand it. I understand that's what it's about. You can wave a magic wand at this table, and tomorrow something simple changes. What is that simple change? If you could do the first thing that
The one thing, it would be trauma care.
Okay.
But before that, I remembered, you mentioned tellers. There's a woman from the bank that I robbed in 1999. Her name's Gwendolyn Bryant. And I'm going to tell this story really briefly, but Gwen and I are friends today. She's actually one of my most trusted friends and confidants who I know I could turn to at any time.
Did you seek her out? How did you find her?
I didn't. She reached out to me a couple years ago.
No kidding. And what did she say?
I want to tell you this story. She came into the vault, and I remember her crumbling to the ground, crying and begging. And I'm thinking to myself, what the fuck is wrong with this girl? Like, I'm not going to hurt her, right? And so I leave the vault to get away from her. After I got arrested, I was in jail, and I didn't hear anything. I didn't hear a whisper of Gwen for 21 months. I didn't know anything. I didn't even know anything about her. And of course, I thought about her periodically. And the day before my sentencing in federal court, she turned in a victim impact statement. And of all things, she asked for an in-person meeting with me. I had a relationship with the U.S. Marshals at that point, and one of the marshals told me, he said, Jacob, you don't have to do this if you don't want to. And I said, if she needs closure, I'm going to give it to her. When she came into my sentencing, Gwen didn't say, I want you to punish this guy and brutalize this guy. She didn't say that. What she said was to guard your thoughts because, what your thoughts become your actions become your character. I forget what that is. But what I didn't forget was she said that I stole her sense of safety from her. And that crushed me because it never occurred to me that anybody felt safe. My first memory is of fear.
Yeah.
I only ever knew violence and danger.
Yeah.
And when I met with her, I cried so profusely that I rubbed skin off my face. I had no idea I had stolen from her something that I didn't even know existed, okay? And when you wonder, how can a person do this? How can you say you didn't understand? If you can believe for a minute that I didn't understand that somebody in society genuinely felt safe, then maybe you can extrapolate that out to the very smaller things, which I just asked a dear friend of mine recently, who honestly I love, like I'm in love with her, to please consider that because like that's the place where if I failed on this enormous thing, then please believe that in these small things I just didn't understand.
Yeah. Well, and again, that's the heart of restorative practice. That's actually what it's supposed to look like, is we're all lacking empathy. I don't know what it's like to be you. And to start to connect deeply to the impact of that, which you would not have known.
2 years ago, it was over 2 years ago, I had my now ex-wife check my Facebook, and we discovered there was this message, this friend requested message, which had been canceled. Gwen had canceled it. She had decided to do it and then canceled it. And it said, hey, Jacob, I just want you to know I'm following some of the things that you're doing in prison, and I'm really proud of you. And I want you to know that I've also healed and I'm finally functional beyond the trauma. And her and I connected and we've talked. And the truth is, my trauma caused her 20 years of trauma.
Yeah.
20 years, over 20 years. And today, honestly, she still has quite a bit of it. I'm sure it never leaves you, right? It stays in you. It stays in your breath, and it stays in your actions. It stays in these conversations. I have felt my brain secrete, and I have felt myself wanting to be violent because of how close and personal these things. I did 5 years in the hole.
Yeah.
Okay, so like a lot of these things that I've spoken to today brings so much emotional unrest to me, but we have to have these conversations.
Yeah.
Critical.
Trauma care. Let's talk about this cycle, because what we have is we have a cycle that nobody knows how to unravel. It's a Gordian knot. do we depolice so that, like, I've had 2 kids where I live in Tukwila, literally in the last 2 months, but it was within 30 days, two people under 20 years old were murdered within a quarter mile of my house. Okay, there was a bus shooting, and the police warned everybody in the neighborhood because the fugitives, I use that as a loose word, got away, and they were hunting for them. And I was like, man, fuck this. I don't want to live like this. I'm going to get shot at the gas. That's not to overlook the murder at the light rail station and the stabbing at the gas station. Or is it backwards? Was it a stabbing and a murder? I don't remember, but they happened right there. I don't want to get killed at a gas station. And in this vein, I agree that we can't stop the police. That's not the point. Even though that's the first point in the process is police contact. I don't believe that's the place to stop in order to fix. And the sentencing that we're giving, are we sentencing to incapacitate to a point where a person is aged out of crime because we know that we don't have the stuff in place while they're incarcerated to actually fix them? Because let's go back to our shit-ass legislature who fucking created the Department of Corrections instead of having it in DSHS and then intentionally removed rehabilitation from its charter. So there is no rehabilitation. You telling me to unwind? You telling me to take it down a notch? My assistant director's back here panicking.
No.
I'm going to be Jacob Schmitt. My name's Jacob Ivan Schmitt, and I'm going to be me. That's not the place that we fix this either because, wait, is it? Or is it the release process and the way? If we're going to pick a place to fix this, let's talk about this. If they have trauma care, and the conditions of confinement are conducive to leaving prison more healthy than they went in, then they will release and with the right support networks transition successfully back into the community, and that we won't have that arrest happen here, which means that the prosecution can stop. But I also want to add that as this flow chart begins, we need things to also change at the other 2 places. Because the point is, we're focused, when I say we, I'm in the social justice movement. I told you a little while ago, I recently had State Representative Lauren Davis tell me that I'm the only person in this work on my side who prioritized victims over something and reached out to her and said, hey, I've identified a problem and a solution and it needs to be fixed. And it was specifically related to people who commit domestic violence because it cycles upwards. And it resulted in deaths that were so brutal or beatings that were so brutal, they sickened me and made me cry. I'm not saying that we don't have to have stuff in place because we do. But if we start fixing this, we will see, we know that our recidivism rates, they say they're 37%. That's a lie.
I've heard that many times.
They're doctoring the numbers because they don't want to look like a failure. The Department of Corrections is, they're all about publicity. And what they exclude from that number are the people who die because of drug overdoses. If you die of a drug overdose, you are in possession of drugs, which means you are committing a crime. We should go ahead and add them into that number. But the reality is we've got this extraordinarily high number of people who recidivate. In many cases, that's because we send them out as a ground ball. Department of Corrections consistently fails in over 90% of the people they're releasing and not getting them Social Security cards and not getting them their birth certificates and not getting them IDs and everywhere across the board. When my friend of 36 years, who had served 36 years, was being released 6 weeks beforehand, 2 people from reentry came and talked to him, 2 middle-aged white women who have no idea what his life has been like, don't know what it was like when he walked into Walla Walla, and they said, grab a mattress, go find a place to live. And he had to go into the jungle, okay? And you know what they did for him for reentry? All they did was contact community organizations to support him. And now our legislature is going to defund those community organizations so there won't be any help. Okay. So
do you remember the first time we talked and you started to talk about trauma and you said, for those who have trauma in prison, and I interrupted you and I said, I assume everybody has a trauma past in prison. And you jumped up and you hugged me. Do you remember that moment? I actually told that story in a council briefing recently. But again, I think that we really conflate this idea. Yes, there's usually victimization. Yes, there is trauma. But that doesn't mean we have compassion for you, so we don't help you. We keep rinsing and repeating. You keep compounding the trauma, basically. This pendulum is swinging. And then what really frustrates me is we don't really get people help until they're very far downstream. That's what I see.
But do they give the help, or do we as a community in the prison give the help? Because the thing is, they don't give the help. If you're incarcerated in the Washington State Department of Corrections, you get 3 one-hour sessions a year with mental health staff, unless you're on psychotropic medication.
Is that true? That's current
100%,
standard?
100% true. I will never lie to you. That is absolutely the truth. I accidentally got into trauma care, and I say accidentally because they were failing in providing me medical care, and I was always upset about it. And Dr. Narkowitz, this little psychiatrist with crazy gray hair, and this other woman who was Dr. Christina Gomes, would come out of their office, and they would show up in the little doorway, and they would talk to me. And Dr. Narkowitz had this really heavy German accent, and Tina was just really, really nice. And Tina was the head of psychology at Twin Rivers unit where I was incarcerated. And she made a specific request to do trauma care with me, internal family systems, that she wanted to do IFS with me. She had to get special permission to do therapy with me, to give me trauma care. And thank God she did, because it helped me understand myself better.
Yeah.
It helped me understand some of these conversations, the things about this have been triggering to me.
Yeah.
You know, my assistant director has waved me down when I'm getting vulgar and expressing curse words and stuff about the legislature. But you know what? I express that based upon the pain of my incarcerated family who still remains in prison way past any point that serves a meaningful function. If we give trauma care and improve the conditions that they're exposed to there, that is the place where we can start. But it's only gonna work if the people who say that they wanna see it happen follow through with actions. Because I hear all of the time, every year, we wanna make these changes and these changes and these changes, because we know that people in prison, there are so many people in there who could be out here. But then when the votes are in on the bills that are introduced in the House and the Senate, they're never enough to carry it across the finish line, which breaks the hearts of the families out here and the community that wants to receive people from in there. I spoke about the lens of suspicion earlier. I was no different a person on September 7th of 2023 than I was on September 8th when I walked out of the Department of Corrections. I was no different a person in March of 2023 when I was viewed with the lens of suspicion, and I couldn't engage in a program. I couldn't build a program. Why is he trying to build this program? Can we really trust him? We've got to watch him. We've got to have all these mechanisms in place. And then I walked out of prison, and all of a sudden I had human value. All of a sudden, magic happened. Let me tell you guys the same thing I tell people who are getting ready to release. That front door isn't a magical portal.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah.
And that magical portal isn't going to walk you happily into ever after. I told those guys yesterday, I said, you know what, man? Don't think I've got it figured out. Most of the time, I don't know if I'm falling apart or getting torn apart. But don't think I got it. Nobody has it figured out. We make decisions as we go. But I was the same person before. And maybe what they need to do within the Department of Corrections is say, we're going to overhaul this place.
Yeah.
And it's time to retire some of you people. But who's going to do it? It's an agency that's bred and fulfilled with apathy.
Thanks so much for listening. Jacob is compelling. He's interesting. He has a long, in-depth life story that's worth hearing. So we are going to follow this up with part 2 so that we can complete the message.
The Bombardened podcast is a Barden Squared production. Executive producers are Eric Barden and Amy Barden, and video and audio production of the Bombardened podcast is by Thread Theory Creative.